introducing our speaker today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mara Lightman in the Anthropology Department. And let me also just thank the African Studies Center, the Department of Anthropology, and the Muslim Studies Program for co-sponsoring our speaker today. I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Alex Thurston, and we're delighted that he was able to spend not just today, but yesterday with us as well. He is an extremely prolific scholar. He's the author of 2 books and numerous journal articles and blogs and policy reports. His first book, Salafism in Nigeria, Islam Preaching and Politics, was published by Cambridge University Press, and I had the pleasure of teaching that to my class, my Islam and Africa class yesterday. And let me just make a big plug for the book. It's, of course, an extremely complicated topic and a very contentious topic. But Dr. Thurston has the keen ability that I'm quite envious of breaking down these things for a more general audience and making these very complicated issues of Salafism very clear and readable. His second book, which he will be talking to us about today, is entitled Boko Haram, A History of an African Jihadist Movement, which was solicited by Princeton University Press for their Muslim politics series, right? Yeah. And he is currently a visiting assistant professor at Miami University of Ohio. He has a joint appointment in political science and comparative religion. Prior to returning to the Midwest last year, he spent 4 years at Georgetown University. He was also working for 1 year in the Nigeria desk of the State Department. And he's working on a 3rd book project, which is nearly complete, I believe, expanding his focus on Salafism in Nigeria to other West African contexts, including Mali, and this was also funded by numerous prestigious grants, including a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson Center, as well as the American Council of Learned Societies. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Thurston, and the title of his talk today is Boko Haram, Political Context, Internal Dynamics, and International Relationships. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Mara, so much for the introduction, and thanks to Mara for inviting me, and to all the co-sponsors for helping put the event together, and thanks also to Mara's class for hosting me yesterday, and thanks also to Liz for all the logistical arrangements and things for my visit. Really delighted to be here with all of you, and thank all of you for coming. I think I'll try to keep to, even just 45 minutes maximum. I know some folks have to leave at 1, and maybe I'll even try to wrap up earlier than that, so that at least the folks who have to leave at 1 will have a little bit of time for discussion. I'll plan to sort of run through a bit of what I cover in the book, and then also to get into some new research or new ways that I'm trying to think about Boko Haram, and ways that I'm trying to think about jihadist movements as being coalitions of different kinds of blocks and factions. So for kind of big picture about where I'm coming from in the book, there were 2 sort of prevailing explanations for Boko Haram that I was reacting against as I was thinking about the book. One is the idea that Boko Haram is a symptom of poverty and regional disparities and structural problems in Nigeria, and particularly within the northeastern part of Nigeria, where the movement was born, and where its violence is still mostly concentrated. This was a major idea and assumption that was prevalent definitely at the State Department when I was working there in 2013, 2014, and that continues to shape some of the thinking about Boko Haram, that it's some sort of an outgrowth of demographics, of again, poverty in particular, of jobless young men and so forth. And we find that kind of explanation of jihadism not just in northeastern Nigeria, but in other parts of the world, that jihadism is a symptom of these kind of structural causes. I think that definitely needs to be part of the explanation, and overall I just lean toward a multi-causal, multi-dimensional explanation for why Boko Haram emerged and for why it's continued to trouble Nigeria and the surrounding countries for so long. But I think that this kind of structural explanation has a little bit of trouble explaining, well, why northeastern Nigeria and not somewhere else, right? It's not like you don't necessarily find, poverty and jobless young men and corruption and weakness of the state in other parts of the same region or in other parts of the world. So why then does Boko Haram emerge in northeastern Nigeria and not in northwestern Nigeria? Why not in Niger or Chad or elsewhere? One could argue that maybe this sort of more structural explanation is being proven, correct as jihadism advances in the Sahel and in other parts of the region, right? The picture in some ways looks bleaker and bleaker over time, especially in the last, year or so. There's been tremendous concern about violence in Burkina Faso, in northern and now in eastern Burkina Faso, even in other parts of that country. So one could say maybe this is evidence that sort of jihadism will eventually spread into many of these places where you have these kind of structural factors. But I still think even if you look at these other contexts where there's more recent jihadist activity, you still find that there are relatively localized explanations for it. And again, we don't see jihadism in every place that has these same set of basic structural conditions. So part of the explanation, I think, but not the whole thing. The other explanation that one often hears is that Boko Haram should be understood as an extension of the global jihadist movement. Essentially that Boko Haram early on was a sort of a front group for al-Qaida, and that more recently Boko Haram should be understood in terms of the Islamic State / ISIS. Boko Haram was never a formal, and I'll get into this in much more detail later on, but sort of briefly, Boko Haram was never a formal affiliate of al-Qaida. It is a formal, or at least part of it is now a formal affiliate of the Islamic State. So definitely and there were, interactions and relationships and at least one sort of documented transfer of funds from al-Qaida to Boko Haram at an early point. So you can't dismiss the explanation of transnational jihadism either. On the other hand, and I'll talk about this more later on, external jihadist actors from al-Qaida or Islamic State found Boko Haram very difficult to control. A lot of times those external actors seem to not know very much about Boko Haram or to have much insight into what was going on there, and Boko Haram seemed to be a relatively low priority for al-Qaida or for Islamic State, even now. So I think that the kind of transnational jihadist lens for looking at Boko Haram also has some real limitations. Again, part of the story, but not a kind of a totalizing explanation for Boko Haram's emergence and sustenance. So what I try to do in the book is to say, okay, well, what are the local, specifically local, like northeastern Nigeria level, or even dynamics in the city of Maiduguri, which is sort of the birthplace of Boko Haram? What are the local dynamics that contributed to the emergence and then the sustenance of this movement? And I was particularly interested in the book to look at interactions between religion and politics. So how do Boko Haram's doctrines, positions, expressions of religiosity, how have those interacted with the political conditions that surround it? And one thing that I argue in the book is that Boko Haram's ideology has actually been somewhat dynamic over time, that there have definitely been consistent elements within it, but particularly on the question of whom Boko Haram considers a Muslim and whom it considers fair game for violence and killing. The movement has actually been quite dynamic. And even at points in its early history, you could find Boko Haram saying things like, look, we don't want secular government, but we can live under a secular government. We can tolerate this kind of situation. And then at other points in their history, you find them saying even basically anybody outside of the movement, government, non-government, Muslim, non-Muslim, is an unbeliever who should be killed. So I think a lot of this actually represents an interaction between Boko Haram and the environment surrounding it. So I try in the book to get at these kind of dialectics between Boko Haram and its environment and between religion and politics in northeastern Nigeria. The plan of the book is basically a chronological history, and I divide Boko Haram's trajectory into 5 different phases. So, and I should add, actually before I say that, I should add that there's kind of a rising sort of third explanation for looking at Boko Haram, and one that I partly agree with and that I partly disagree with. And it's I think what I would call sort of a deep historical approach, an argument that there are, and this came up in Mara's class yesterday, that there are recurring cycles and trends in northern Nigeria, and that Boko Haram is the latest in a series of those cycles, or that there are a series of kind of patterns in what's now the border region between northeastern Nigeria, northern Cameroon, southeastern Niger, Chad, and so forth. And again, the Boko Haram is just the latest iteration of a cycle, be it a cycle of Muslim dissenters arising and first separating from the community and then coming back to try to overthrow the community or the established leaders, or be it, there's a recent book by Scott McAkern from Oxford University Press that looks at kind of deep historical patterns of slave raiding and cross-border movement in the Lake Chad Basin. I think the deep historical approach has the advantage of contextualizing things in a deeply local way, right? And moving away from what I consider the much more sort of generic explanations of Boko Haram as a symptom of poverty or Boko Haram as an extension of the global jihad. So I think this deep historical approach has a lot of merit in that sense and has taught me a lot and shed a lot of light on dynamics and origins of the movement. And has helped to sort of de-exceptionalize Boko Haram in a certain way, at least in the context of its local, antecedents. But at the same time, I think sometimes it can look too neat as a view of history, and it can downplay some of the historical specificities of Boko Haram in its own context. And there are ways, be it, in terms of context, in terms of actual theology, in terms of tactics, in terms of their relationship with the surrounding communities, where Boko Haram, I think, is actually really different than some of these antecedents from northern Nigeria's past or from the Lake Chad Basin's past. So my own approach in the book is to look at Boko Haram in a historical context, but basically within the historical lifetime of the people who make up the movement. So I divide it into 5 phases, the trajectory of the movement, and begin with what we might call the prehistory of Boko Haram. So looking at the conditions and the events that were surrounding the leaders as they grew up. So what was it like to be Muhammad Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram, who was born in 1970 in a very remote part of northeastern Nigeria? What was it like to be Abu Bakr Shekau, who has become kind of the face of the movement and is the current leader of one faction, he was probably born in the late 60s or the early 70s, again, in an extremely remote part of northeastern Nigeria. So what did these, boys and men, what did they experience as they grew up? What would have been the kinds of, events and things that they would have heard about or that would have affected them directly that shaped who they were? Part of the challenge there is that some of their biographies, including their early biographies, are really murky and opaque to us, and are murky even for Boko Haram itself. So sometimes they put out, hagiographies or from different sides within Boko Haram's fights, denunciations of Muhammad Yusuf or Shekau, but it's clear even in their own sources that they don't necessarily know that much about these guys' early lives. And it was interesting. I think it was a journalistic outfit. I think it was Voice of America within the past year or year and a half tracked down Shekau's mother in his own village and interviewed her. And it was pretty clear that she didn't really know that much about a lot of his life. And partly that's because their teens sometimes were spent traveling from place to place or settling in cities, and we don't really have a lot of sources or evidence about what they were up to. So I tried instead to construct what I call like the life world, and in a sense to do some informed speculation about what it would have been like to be them growing up. And I looked in particular at their later preaching and things that they mentioned about things that had happened in the 1980s or earlier, and to try to get a sense of what events might have affected them. So I think a few things we can use to try to fill in the gaps on what affected these guys. So for one thing, they were born in really remote areas, but they were deeply affected by urbanization, right? They, like, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other people from northeastern Nigeria were pulled toward the city of Maiduguri and settled there as young men. Second, their worldview seems to have been really marked by incidents of Muslim Christian violence in Nigeria in the 1980s and afterwards. This was something that Yusuf would talk a lot about in his preaching, referring back to kind of infamous events in Nigerian history, Muslim Christian clashes, and events that had happened far from where they grew up, but that became symbols to them of what they considered the Nigerian state's bias against Muslims and the failure of the state, again, in their eyes, to do justice by Muslims, and just a kind of a symbol of how Muslims were, for them, on the defensive and under attack in Nigeria, even in the north. And then I try to go through some other trends, trends in the educational sector, ways that government initiatives, for example, to promote universal primary education or other forms of mass education ended up falling flat. And so I go through different, government reports and other sources to kind of document ways, even that authorities were noticing that there was a kind of a rising skepticism about Western-style education or about, the ways that governments had sort of raised people's hopes about education, and then how things had fallen flat and those hopes had been dashed, and there seems to have been a sort of a bitterness. And so, when we even come to the name Boko Haram, right, which is usually translated as Western-style education is forbidden, or Western-style education is legally forbidden under Islam, it can sound sort of shocking, right? Why would anybody say this? And of course, opponents of Yusuf in the Nigerian context, other Muslims would routinely say, look, this kind of message is actually going to really, really hurt the Muslim community, right? How can you tell people not to go to school? How can you say that a Western-style school would be, forbidden? But I think part of the background is, again, these trends that were occurring during their own Nigerian context. Other Muslims where routinely say, look, really been raised around this kind of message is actually going to be dashed, really, really hurt the Muslim community. And then another kind of trend that I try to look at how can you say that a Western-style school would be just religious fragmentation. But I think part of the background is, again, these trends that were occurring during their own Nigerian context. Other Muslims where routinely say, look, this kind of message is actually, particularly after the 1970s, really, really hurt the Muslim community. And then another kind of trend that I try to look at is say that a Western-style school would be just religious fragmentation. But I think part of the background is, again, these trends that were occurring during their own Nigerian context. Other Muslims where routinely say, look, this kind of message is actually, particularly after the 1970s, really, really hurt the Muslim community. And then another kind of trend that I try to look at is say that a Western-style school would be just religious fragmentation. But I think part of the background is, again, these trends that were occurring during their own Nigerian context. Other Muslims where routinely say, look, this kind of message is actually, particularly after the 1970s, really, really hurt the Muslim community. And then another kind of trend that I try to look at is say that a Western-style school would be just religious fragmentation. But I think part of the background is, again, these trends that were occurring during their own Nigerian context. Other Muslims where routinely say, look, this kind of message is actually, particularly after the 1970s, really, really hurt the Muslim community. And then another kind of trend that I try to look at, particularly when you put some of these trends together, the religious fragmentation, the urbanization, the partial collapse of faith in the education sector, in part, one just key question in the book is or just with Boko Haram in general, how was somebody like Yusuf in his early 30s, relatively uneducated, not having any kind of formal credentials from Saudi Arabia or from any Nigerian university, how was he able to put together some mass movement, right, and attract this large following at a time when in the Nigerian context, in the northern Nigerian context, a lot of people would have still considered him basically a boy. How was he able to do this and put together this mass movement? So I try to, by looking at these trends that we're operating with in his lifetime, get toward an explanation of that. The second phase that I look at is basically Muhammad Yusuf's preaching career. So he, in the early 2000s, began to develop these kind of two signature stances that in a sense still define the movement. One, that Muslims should not send their children to Western-style schools, and second, that Muslims should not be employed by a secular government. And this evolved then even to the idea that secular governments were inherently not just un-Islamic, but anti-Islamic, and needed to be not just, you needed not just to withdraw, but to actively confront the secular or the infidel government. So he began, preaching in this way and attracting mass audiences with these messages and with other forms of, teaching and so forth that he did. But at the same time, he was really experimenting with politics. So even as he was saying that secular government was completely impermissible, or at least that Muslims should keep their distance from it, we find him at the same time interacting with politicians, especially early in his career. And to me, I've been pretty persuaded by, serious allegations that in the 2003 election in his home state, so the second election after Nigeria returned to democracy in 1999, that in that second election in 2003, that he made a deal with the gubernatorial challenger in that year's election. And they each had something to offer the other. Basically, Yusuf could offer, or try to offer, the votes of his followers, right? A mass following, attractive particularly to the gubernatorial challenger trying to oust an incumbent. At the same time, then the incumbent, again, at least allegedly, could offer Yusuf positions for his members within the cabinet, of the new government, or could offer other forms of support. So Yusuf, seems to have been trying to navigate a way for himself through politics, and seems to have just been an extremely ambitious person in general. Somebody who was, interested in pursuing power and influence. And for a while, he also seems to have been able to, especially if we believe some of his opponents, he seems to have been able to say different things to different people and maintain this kind of balancing act, where he would take a very hardline stance in his preaching toward his followers, but where he would take a more conciliatory approach to, dealing with politicians or with other elites, and where he was beginning to clash with other clerics, but some of his opponents among the clerics describe a series of meetings where they would meet with Yusuf and they would say, look, you got to stop preaching against Western-style education and the government, you're going to stir up a bunch of trouble. And he would say, okay. And then he would go back out and preach again. This is, again, the account of his opponents, right? So there's, and Yusuf has described those meetings differently. But in any case, it seems for a while that he attempted this sort of balancing act, where he would attract followers with the hardline message, but then where he would still try to keep an influence for himself in the mainstream politics and in the mainstream religious sphere. One problem for him, though, was that he was attracting people with this hardline message who were even more hardline than he was. People who wanted to say, okay, let's follow this argument to its logical conclusion, right? If Muslims shouldn't work for a secular government, then let's go further and let's say that Muslims need to actively withdraw from society altogether, or that they need to actively make preparations to confront and overthrow the Nigerian state. So even at an early point in his career, a group of his followers kind of broke off and established a sort of community / even training camp in a very remote part of the Northeast, and then quickly came into conflict with authorities and military clashes and so forth. So Yusuf was finding, even at an early point in his preaching, that it was very hard to sustain this balancing act, right? To keep getting along with the authorities, but also to say really hardline things and attract these super hardliners. And I think, again, another question with him, another thing that's hard to explain, concerns the end of his life. So in 2009, he and his followers came into an escalating series of clashes with the authorities in his home state. And then in July of 2009, he launched this mass uprising in his home state and in various other states, leading to over 1,000 deaths and leading to his own capture by police and his summary execution at the hands of the police. So why would somebody do this, right? Why take up the time to build this mass movement and then just hurl it against the Nigerian state and not only get thousands of your followers killed, but get yourself killed, right? Why? Especially if you were originally an ambitious person who wanted, a place in politics. Why would you challenge the Nigerian state in this sort of suicidal way? And I think for me, my again, and this is sort of informed speculation, is to say that he backed himself into a corner, right? I think he got to a place where he was surrounded, again, by people who were much more hardline than he was, and where, especially once there started to be this sort of tit for tat between Boko Haram and the authorities, I think he found himself in a place where he couldn't back down, right? Where if he had backed down at that point, he would have looked like a super hypocrite and possibly even been killed by some of his own followers. So, in a way, the story of this second phase is a story where he tries to do this balancing act, but ultimately can't sustain it because it's just too irreconcilable, the things that he wanted to do, to be influential in politics, but also to be this hardline preacher. The third phase then is from roughly 2009 or 2010 to 2014, when Boko Haram began to reemerge as this underground insurgency. So if earlier there had been different perspectives within the movement, should we, constitute ourselves as a preaching movement, or should we try to, again, withdraw from society? Should we try to, overcome, and overthrow the Nigerian state? If those questions were still debated in that earlier period, the debate seems to have ended with this mass uprising in 2009. And what was left of the movement then reconstituted itself as basically a guerrilla force, and began to stage, attacks first in the Northeast, but then, very quickly coming to national and international attention, including with major suicide bombings in the capital in the summer of 2011. And so part of, I think, the story there and part of the way that they evolved was, had to do with their reactions to the uprising of 2009, their reactions to the summary execution of Yusuf in police custody, their reactions to feelings that they had been, betrayed and targeted by some of their former allies among the state politicians. And then toward the end of this period, and things were basically progressively getting out of control, toward the end of this period, I think that the conflict started to be driven in part by wider dynamics of what Human Rights Watch at one point called spiraling violence. So not just really heavy-handed violence by the state security forces, but also kinds of collective punishment where the military in particular was widely and credibly accused, and still is, of torture, of detaining young men, en masse, of holding people, not letting them see their relatives, of killing people on the spot, basically all kinds of abuses and forms of collective punishment. And so I think there started to be a dynamic that took hold where Boko Haram became partly fueled by these abuses on the part of the state. And they would talk about this in their propaganda, and they would target sites where Boko Haram members or suspected members were being held, and this became part of even the propaganda and the sort of identity of the group. And then they fit those events back into the longer history that they had already felt was anti-Muslim in Nigeria. So they would say the way that Yusuf was killed is part of this pattern of these events in the 1980s that we were already upset about. The killing of Yusuf is further confirmation that the Nigerian state is anti-Muslim and will kill Muslims. And then toward the end of that period, you have the rise of what's been called the Civilian Joint Task Force, the CJTF. So the Joint Task Force of the JTF is an official Nigerian military unit. The CJTF was government-backed vigilantes in the Northeast. There's a question as to whether the vigilantes were an organic formation that then received government backing, or whether they were sort of seeded by the government and stood up in that fashion. But in any case, after the vigilantes emerged, they were backed by the government through funding, through even vigilantes and soldiers fighting side by side and so forth. The vigilantes had the major advantage that they were from the Northeast, right? Sometimes they knew, not just the terrain and the geography intimately, but they also knew who the Boko Haram members were, right, or who their families were. So the civilian vigilantes were able to make considerable progress, especially in the city of Maiduguri, in kicking Boko Haram out. The unintended consequence, though, is what moved things into a different phase, into basically a fourth phase, where after Boko Haram was pushed out of the cities, or largely pushed out of the cities, they began to take towns and rural areas and officially control them and declare that they were ruling over them as a state. And they talked a lot in this time about the civilian vigilantes and how they were reacting against this. And another dynamic that took hold in this period was a growing harshness in how Boko Haram talked about other Muslims, right? And this is the time when you really start to hear from Shekau, who had taken over after Yusuf was killed. This is when you start to hear from Shekau, basically, if you're not with us, then you're fair game to be killed, right? If you're not with us, then you forfeit your Islam. Even any kind of tacit cooperation or even acquiescence to the presence of the authorities where you live, you sacrifice your Islam in that way and you become a legitimate target for violence. And again, I think in a way, this was just sort of the logical implication of some of their earlier arguments, but I think it was also heavily driven by events. And you know, that again, this dialectic took hold where the state had trouble confronting Boko Haram, so they stood up the civilian vigilantes. Boko Haram had, you know, then reacted to the civilian vigilantes, not just militarily or politically, but also ideologically. The fifth phase then began, I would say, in early 2015. So as Boko Haram was carving out territory, and you always hear the figure, you know, a territory the size of Belgium. But in any case, you know, a significant amount of territory in 3 states in the far northeast. As they were doing this, the neighboring countries, and I think also the United States and the UK and France and so forth, began to be, you know, deeply, deeply concerned. I mean, the kidnapping of the Chibok girls in April of 2014 had caused, as you all know, massive international outcry. You know, Michelle Obama tweeting about it and so forth. But I think it was the taking of territory in particular that really, really alarmed Nigeria's neighbors and some of the international powers. And so in early 2015, then the armies of Chad and Niger in particular came into Nigerian territory. And there were, you know, and it's still somewhat murky to make, you know, to figure out all that was going on. You know, there were South African mercenaries hired by the Nigerian government. I mean, there were a lot of different, you know, actors on the scene, but they were able to push Boko Haram out of most of these areas that it controlled. And so to sort of simplify things, since that time, there's been more or less a stalemate. You know, Boko Haram doesn't really, on the whole, try to, you know, hold territory anymore. But the military and you know, the authorities have not been able to sort of defeat them. And this, you know, this is a wider kind of dynamic in you know, counterinsurgency or counter-jihadist campaigns around the world. And you know, International Crisis Group and others have written about this in really effective ways, that you can dislodge jihadists from cities that they control, right? If you know, or areas that they control. If you know where they are, you can come and kick them out of where they are. But once they withdraw into really remote areas, it's a lot harder to sort of destroy them, especially if part of the process of trying to like exterminate them involves a great deal of collective punishment and other, you know, tendencies that then can reinforce the very conflict that you're trying to stamp out. So sometimes, you know, particularly in the last, you know, maybe 2 years, sometimes it has appeared as though the Nigerian authorities, military and civilian, are partly ceding the countryside to you know, different factions of Boko Haram. Even the governor of Borno State, which is in the far northeast, where a lot of the fighting has been, you know, at one point talked about how they were essentially looking at sort of garrison towns or garrison cities, Borno, that they were going to pick, you know, say 5 cities, and basically they were going to defend those cities. That's where the, you know, displaced were going to come. But the implication of this again was that the countryside was partly, you know, out of control. And recently there's been, you know, a certain sort of uptick in violence and dynamics where, for example, you know, Boko Haram fighters will come and, you know, attack small military outposts and steal the weapons and things like that, which then can build momentum for further attacks. And so they're really far from defeated. And for myself, I question whether it's really even possible to sort of defeat a jihadist group, right? Maybe we can come back to that later. Another then crucial dynamic during this phase that maybe we're still in has been a formal splintering of Boko Haram into 2 factions. So as Boko Haram was being driven back in early 2015 from this territory that it controlled or had controlled, they pledged allegiance to the Islamic State and became a formal affiliate of Islamic State / ISIS. But pretty quickly some infighting arose within the group over that question and just over the leadership of Abu Bakr Shekau. And so in August of 2016, the Islamic State the central leadership of the Islamic State formally recognized a different person, one of Mohammed Yusuf's sons, or at least somebody purporting to be one of his sons, as the new governor of the West Africa province. And so then Shekau, the implication of this was that Shekau was dethroned. So now, you know, a lot of analysts will talk about Boko Haram, and when they say Boko Haram, they mean Shekau's faction. And when they talk about this other faction, they call them Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP, or ISWA. And that's, the faction that still has kind of the formal blessing of the Islamic State. Part of the argument between them concerned not just these transnational connections or even the question of Shekau as this divisive figure, but also concerned approaches. And here I think we see yet another element of the dialectic, between ideology and events. So part of the argument that the so-called Islamic State West Africa province has made is that Shekau went way too far in killing Muslim civilians. The one argument that the ISWAP faction made right when they declared their existence was, we're not going to plant bombs in mosques and markets. If a Muslim civilian happens to be living under Nigerian government control, they're not an unbeliever by default. And the ISWAP faction said, look, we're going to refocus our violence on Nigerian government and military targets and on Christians. We're not going to slaughter Muslim civilians anymore. So, and I think that they pulled back from that, and it's always hard to know what's in people's hearts. I think they pulled back from that partly out of conviction, but I think partly because this is a dead-end strategy, right? Even if you accept the other premises of jihadism, to say that everybody outside of our group, Muslim or non-Muslim, we're going to kill and consider an infidel, you're going to run into a dead end where you have extremely little support, right? And so, the fear among analysts and others, policymakers, has been that ISWAP has more kind of political potential than Boko Haram, right? That ISWAP could evolve kinds of arrangements with local communities and so forth that would make it capable not just of existing as a guerrilla force, but of challenging the authority of the Nigerian state on a sustained basis by kind of out-competing them in terms of relationships with local communities. And again, the state is, absent or very weak in a lot of the rural Northeast. So there is some potential for ISWAP, maybe in particular, to build some political sway there. So this leads back into the question of the relationships between Boko Haram and external jihadist actors. And this is something that I'm trying to work on in some new research, partly because there have been some crucial sources that have come out since my book came out. In particular, the ISWAP side published basically a self-history last summer, which goes through their version of events and of what happened, and goes through this issue of some of the interactions with al-Qaida early on, and then this whole issue of how the pledge to the Islamic State unfolded and how the schism between the groups developed, between the two factions of Boko Haram developed. So the kind of argument that I'm testing and thinking about is, first of all, that Boko Haram was always something of a coalition, that it wasn't just necessarily a unitary pyramid under Yusuf or under Shekau, but that there were different constituencies and sub-constituencies within the group. One thing I'm thinking about there is, or two things I'm thinking about there are ethnicity and geography. So with ethnicity, I want to be really careful because sometimes in DC, with American policymakers and so forth, I'll hear the analysis. Boko Haram is really basically an ethnic movement. It's an ethnic movement of the Kanuri people from northeastern Nigeria. And when you hear, and the data about who makes up Boko Haram is really kind of, rough and imprecise, but you oftentimes hear the figure, okay, Boko Haram is 70% Kanuri. Mohammed Yusuf was Kanuri, Abu Bakr Shekau is Kanuri. If this person who leads the ISWAP faction is really Yusuf's son, then he, of course, would be Kanuri too. So there's this kind of Kanuri dominance. But at the same time, I want to be careful with all this because Boko Haram has never presented themselves as a Kanuri movement per se. When in their propaganda, they use either Arabic or most of the time Hausa, which is the lingua franca of northern Nigeria and beyond. They don't talk about restoring. They don't talk about making the Kanuri great again or something like that, right? They tend to again frame their claims as in terms of jihadist ideology. So I'm trying to think about coalition politics within the group in a way that accounts for ethnicity, but without making ethnicity into some kind of totalizing explanation for the group. And then two, I'm thinking about geography and where people came from. And one interesting thing about some of these new internal sources that have come out from Boko Haram is that they tend to give pseudonyms for, you know, everybody, right? So to be, you know, such and such, you know, person, you know, Abu Muhammad al-Barnawi or whatever, you know. So Muhammad's dad from Borno, basically. But even though they're pseudonyms, they give oftentimes surnames that are geographical markers, right? And I think, you know, maybe this is naive on my part, but I think it's probably genuine, you know. I mean, even though the names are pseudonyms, the geographical markers indicate where the person's actually from. So you can start to sort of map a little bit who was from where. And it does seem oftentimes that, you know, leadership positions, and especially, you know, field commanders who had mass, you know, blocks of fighters under their command were people from the Northeast. Not that there weren't members from other parts of the North or even from Chad or elsewhere, but the really sort of, you know, to have a decisive voice in Boko Haram's internal affairs, that you needed to be from the Northeast and maybe even you needed to be Kanuri. So one thing I'm looking at is ways that what I would call sort of second-tier leaders within the group tried to leverage their ties to outside jihadist organizations. So basically at different points within the group, within the history, you had people, it looks like, you know, approaching Yusuf and approaching Shekau and approaching others and saying, hey, I can put you in touch with al-Qaida, I can put you in touch with Islamic State. So even during Yusuf's lifetime, you know, it's getting pretty solidly documented now that, you know, there was a sort of a shadowy figure early on who was close to Yusuf and who had ties even to Osama bin Laden directly. By the end of Yusuf's life, there were people around him, and even on what's called his Shura Council, or his like consultative council, who had fought and trained with the al-Qaida affiliate in the Sahara. You know, then definitely we have now, you know, correspondence, both that's been published officially by jihadists and that's been, you know, declassified by the CIA after they recovered it. Correspondence showing interactions between Shekau and you know, again, this al-Qaida affiliate in the Sahara, basically. And then, of course, you have the whole question of the Pledge of Allegiance to the Islamic State. So the kind of pattern that I'm thinking about in all of these interactions is it seems that, again, these ties were sometimes much more important for the second-tier leaders than they were for the top leaders. And that particularly if you were not from the Northeast, but you had these kind of ties, it was a way to kind of try to rise within the group because it was something that you could offer to Yusuf or to Shekau or to somebody else. One issue though and of course the top tier leaders sometimes had a lot of interest in these ties. You know, it's hard to tell with Yusuf exactly what he had in mind. Shekau definitely seems to have invested heavily in trying to build a relationship with al-Qaida and with the Saharan affiliate of al-Qaida early on. But the top leaders had, you know, different incentives, and there were limits to how far they wanted to go in working with some of these al-Qaida affiliates. So particularly with Shekau, we found a lot of complaints from the al-Qaida side that basically he was capricious, that he didn't follow orders, that he would say one thing to them but then do another. You know, that he was, that his version of doctrine was just much more extreme even than al-Qaeda's and so forth. So the top leaders often seem to have had their own kind of visions in mind of how they wanted to do things. They were glad to take money, they were glad to send people to train, but they didn't necessarily want to be, you know, dictated to about how to approach things. This then led to situations where some of the second-tier leaders would try to leverage their international connections to break away from Boko Haram. So you had one kind of short-lived breakaway group called Ansar al-Muslimin, or the Defenders of the Muslims, that stood up in you know, 2011, 2012, and basically tried to leverage the ties that they had to al-Qaida to break with Shekau, to take a different approach and to challenge his authority. One problem, though, was that a lot of those leaders were not from the core Northeast. And so when they broke away, they didn't take a lot of fighters with them. And this left them sort of doubly vulnerable. For one thing, they didn't really have the fighter base to challenge the Nigerian state in a serious way. And then they were also vulnerable to reprisals from Shekau's side. So you even read, you know, accounts of Shekau kind of killing off his former lieutenants and ordering their assassinations and so forth. There also may have been, you know, and this is something I'm still thinking about, there may have been a dynamic within Boko Haram where certain people were off limits for being assassinated, even if they disagreed with Shekau. And it looks like basically if you were from the Northeast and if you were Kanuri, you stood a better chance of not being killed by Shekau if you disagreed with him. Whereas if you were an outsider, even if you were from a different part of the North and you challenged his authority, you could be killed, in some cases basically on the spot. So again, I'm trying to think through some of these geographical and ethnic divisions that seem to have showed up within Boko Haram. The difference then that I've been thinking about with Islamic State West Africa province, so why, if earlier efforts to break off from Boko Haram and to leverage transnational ties to kind of marginalize Shekau, if that had failed before, why did it work in the case of this ISWAP? I think one big reason is they found a figurehead or a leader who was from the Northeast, and who was even, again, possibly the son of Muhammad Yusuf. So, a Kanuri person from the Northeast with this genealogical credibility to lead the movement. Then, too, he was able to secure the allegiance of some key, field commanders from the Northeast. So, again, unlike earlier breakaways that had maybe they had ties to al-Qaida, but they didn't have, thousands of fighters backing them. Once it got to this split in 2016, the dissidents were able to take, serious field commanders with serious numbers with them. And the estimate that's often given now is that, Shekau's Boko Haram has 1,500 fighters and that this ISWAP has even 3,500 fighters. So in fact, they took, even almost, approaching, more than 2/3 of the fighters with them. Also, it seems like, over time, Shekau had really kind of antagonized people, and that by the time it got to 2016, the complaints about him, taking people's property, killing people arbitrarily, seizing women and marrying them without their consent or without other people's consent, and sort of charges that he had mismanaged the group, had really escalated to a point, again, where not just sort of dissidents within the group who were from other parts of the North, but where core field commanders in the Northeast were willing to break away. And they also just seem to have been in really terrible shape after this period when the Chadian and the Nigerian and Nigerian armies had pushed them out of the Northeast. There's in this kind of history, the ISWAP release of itself, they talk about this period, 2015, 2016, they talk about, being in the forest and eating the bark off of trees and just being, starving, basically. So things had to get really, really pretty bad before people would break with Shekau, but they had gotten to that point where, again, some of the major, even core field commanders were willing to break away. I think there would be more to say. There would be a little to say about, the presidential elections and so forth, and how that has, intersected with, or not intersected with Boko Haram's violence. But maybe it'd be a good time to transition to Q&A, because I know some folks may have to leave relatively soon. I want to give them a chance. Thanks.
Well, thank you.
Or did you want to?
No, thank you very much, Alex. Let me just, you can field your own questions. Let me just state for those live streaming and joining us remotely that I would need everybody to please speak into the microphone when you ask your question so you can be heard. But please field your own questions. I'll pass around the mic, or do we have another one?
Oh, no, I was just going to pass